Tonight, we begin with a development that NATO officials, Turkish intelligence services, and regional security analysts had anticipated, dismissed, and ultimately feared. A border breach that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the calculus of the entire Syrian frontier. Hours that forced Ankara's hand in ways not seen since Operation Clawsword. Hours that may have permanently altered the balance of power along the Turkish-Syrian border. What Bashar al-Assad's forces did today crossed a line that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had publicly warned would not hold. And when that line broke, Ankara did not hesitate. They responded with precision, overwhelming force, and unmistakable resolve. This is a story that began with a breach, escalated with a warning, and ended with the kind of military response that sends shockwaves not just through Damascus, but through Moscow, Tehran, and every regional capital watching from the sidelines. Tonight, we break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what comes next. For nearly 18 months now, there had been signals, not official statements from Damascus, not formal communications through diplomatic back channels, just signals that Assad's regime was preparing something unprecedented. Assad has been provocative, yes, but he has been calculated in his provocations. His moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a choreography that Turkish intelligence had come to recognize and anticipate. But what set off alarm bells in Ankara this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Syrian military activity know the indicators. The repositioning of artillery units near the border, the sudden increase in encrypted communications between Damascus and field commanders, the movement of Iranian-backed militia forces toward Turkish observation posts, the sudden withdrawal of Russian advisory personnel from forward positions. All of that went quiet. And whenever Assad goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Turkish National Intelligence Organization officials had been tracking what they described as anomalous behavior from Syrian regime forces for the past 72 hours. Satellite imagery showed vehicle convoys moving under the cover of darkness. Signals intelligence picked up communications referencing Operation Southern Shield, a term that had never appeared in Assad's military lexicon before. Something was coming. Turkey knew it. NATO knew it. The question was when and where. That question was answered at 04:17 local time this morning. Early Thursday morning, Turkish border surveillance detected what they described as a coordinated multi-axis incursion, including armored personnel carriers that had not been deployed to the northern frontier in over 3 years. These are the kinds of assets that Assad's military only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: a territorial claim, a political provocation, or an outright military challenge. Turkish commanders didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Assad was changing his posture. And when a weakened but defiant regime shifts posture without explanation, even by a single kilometer, Ankara pays attention. According to Turkish Defense Ministry sources, Syrian forces crossed into a demilitarized buffer zone established under the 2019 Sochi Agreement, an agreement guaranteed by Russia and designed to prevent exactly this kind of escalation. The incursion involved approximately 300 personnel, supported by at least 12 armored vehicles and mobile artillery platforms. This was not a patrol that wandered off course. This was not a navigational error. This was a deliberate breach of Turkish-controlled territory, and Assad's forces did not stop at the boundary line. They advanced nearly 4 kilometers into the buffer zone before establishing what appeared to be fortified positions. In military terms, this was not a probe. This was an occupation. The warning issued by Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after briefing described Assad's move as reckless, calculated, and perhaps most importantly, irreversible in its consequences. But provocation only works if the target hesitates. Turkey did not. In fact, their response today was among the most comprehensive military operations we've seen in northern Syria since the fall of ISIS's territorial caliphate. Here's what we know. Within 90 minutes of the border breach being confirmed, Turkey scrambled F-16 fighter jets from Diyarbakir Air Base. These weren't the routine patrol flights that crisscrossed Turkish airspace daily. These were fully armed strike packages, weapon systems that Turkey only deploys when they are preparing to engage hardened targets with lethal intent. Simultaneously, Turkish artillery batteries along the border opened fire on Syrian positions that had been dormant for months. The coordination was immediate, the response was overwhelming, and the message was unmistakable. President Erdogan, speaking to reporters before an emergency National Security Council meeting, said simply, "Those who test Turkey's patience will receive Turkey's answer," and that answer has now been delivered. Tonight, the Turkish armed forces confirmed that Turkish warplanes launched precision strikes on 17 separate targets, including a forward command post that had recently been activated for what analysts believe was direct oversight of the incursion. Turkey struck before Assad's forces could consolidate their positions. They hit the armored vehicles that had crossed into the buffer zone. They hit the artillery emplacements that were preparing to provide fire support. They hit the logistics convoys that were likely preparing to resupply and reinforce the incursion force. In other words, Turkey targeted the entire operational chain, the command structure that would have directed it, the firepower that would have defended it, the supply lines that would have sustained it. This is what made Ankara's response so urgent. Assad's breach wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could establish a new territorial reality if left unchecked. And Turkey, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike Damascus. They didn't target Assad's presidential compound. They didn't escalate to regime leadership. They hit the incursion force itself. They hit the infrastructure supporting it. They sent a message that was tactical in execution, but strategic in intent. Cross this line, and you will be destroyed where you stand. According to initial battle damage assessments, Turkish strikes destroyed at least 9 armored vehicles, neutralized 3 artillery positions, and killed or wounded an estimated 70 Syrian military personnel. Several sources suggest the actual casualty figures may be significantly higher, though Damascus has remained silent on the matter. The Syrian regime has not issued any official statement as of this broadcast. That silence speaks volumes, and here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence analysts now believe that Assad's border breach was designed to test the resolve of Turkish military forces after months of political instability in Ankara and economic pressure at home. Assad wanted to see whether Erdogan would respond with rhetoric instead of action, but instead the opposite happened. Turkey didn't issue statements. They didn't convene committees. They didn't request emergency UN Security Council sessions. They launched a military operation that was so swift, so coordinated, that even Damascus noticed. You don't get Assad's attention easily, but today Turkey did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Assad's incursion as a stress test, a way to probe Turkish readiness and potentially expose weaknesses in NATO's southeastern flank. But Turkey proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Syrian forces had no opportunity to disperse or seek cover. That timing matters because it shows Turkish intelligence had been tracking this operation in real time. It shows that Turkey is not a passive observer of Syrian military movements. They are an active participant in shaping the battle space, and tonight they shaped it decisively. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Turkey's response. Turkish Air Force F-16s carried out 3 separate strike waves, forcing Syrian air defense systems to remain dormant for fear of revealing their positions. Turkish artillery units targeted military infrastructure that had been reinforced in the last 48 hours. Turkish armed drones operating along the border reportedly destroyed communications equipment used by Assad's forces to coordinate with Iranian-backed militias in the region. This wasn't just a retaliatory strike. This wasn't just a proportional response. This was a demonstration of capability. This was a reassertion of deterrence. And deterrence is the one thing Assad has struggled to maintain since Russia began withdrawing attention and resources toward Ukraine. For every advance Assad has made in recent months, Turkey has countered with something that complicates his calculations. Today's operation was the most dramatic example yet. Turkish military sources confirmed that additional forces have been moved to forward positions along the border, including tank battalions and special operations units that had previously been held in reserve. Ankara is not treating this as a one-time event. They are preparing for the possibility that Assad will try again. Remember, Assad thought Turkey was distracted by domestic economic challenges. He thought NATO's attention was fixed entirely on Ukraine and the Baltic states. He thought Russian diplomatic cover would shield him from serious consequences. He thought Erdogan's coalition government would be too fragile to authorize decisive military action. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Turkey responded within hours, not days. NATO issued statements of support within the same news cycle. Russian officials have remained conspicuously silent. a silence that suggests Moscow was not consulted before Assad's move and may not be willing to defend it. And Erdogan's government appears more unified than it has been in months, rallying around a national security response that crosses partisan lines. Assad miscalculated, and tonight he is paying the price for that miscalculation. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Assad's border breach happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Iranian hardliners want more aggressive action against Turkish-backed opposition forces in Idlib. Russian military advisors want Assad to conserve resources and avoid provoking NATO responses. Regime loyalists want visible victories to justify years of sacrifice and suffering. Syrian civilians want an end to the conflict that has destroyed their country. Assad is balancing these demands while managing an economy in freefall and a military stretched to its breaking point. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Today's incursion may have been Assad's attempt to demonstrate relevance, to show his backers in Tehran and Moscow that he remains a player worth supporting. But Turkey's response has demonstrated something else entirely. Assad remains vulnerable, exposed, and unable to protect his forces from Turkish firepower. That's not the message Assad wanted to send, but it's the message the world received. NATO's emergency statement, now distributed to all member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow territorial violations against a member nation to go unanswered. Alliance officials said plainly that Assad's incursion was inconsistent with international norms and the established framework for de-escalation in Syria. That is diplomatic language for this was an act of aggression, and Turkey had every right to respond. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. The United States, in a separate statement, confirmed that American military assets in the region had been placed on heightened alert and that Washington was in continuous communication with Ankara regarding the situation. Several European foreign ministries issued statements expressing concern over the escalation, while notably declining to criticize Turkey's military response. The message from the West was clear: Assad crossed a line. Turkey responded, and no one is going to second-guess Ankara's right to defend its borders. Meanwhile, President Erdogan addressed the Turkish Grand National Assembly in a forceful, unapologetic speech tonight. He said, "Turkey will never allow foreign forces to establish themselves on our borders. We have shown patience, we have shown restraint, but patience has limits, and those limits were crossed today." He said, "Our response was not emotional. It was calculated. It was necessary, and it was just the beginning if provocation continues." And he said, "Let this be a message to all who would test Turkey's resolve. We are not a nation that issues warnings we do not intend to enforce." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a government that understands just how high the stakes have become. Erdogan has staked his political credibility on defending Turkish sovereignty. Tonight, he demonstrated that credibility is backed by military capability. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Assad's border breach wasn't isolated. Along with the ground incursion, Iranian-backed militias also increased their presence near Turkish observation posts in Idlib province. Hezbollah-affiliated units repositioned forces within striking distance of Turkish-controlled areas. Russian reconnaissance aircraft increased their flights along the Turkish border, flights that appeared designed to gather intelligence on Turkish military positions. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Assad moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Whether this represents a coordinated strategy with Tehran and Moscow, or Assad acting independently to test boundaries, the result is the same. Turkey now faces pressure on multiple fronts, and tonight's military response was designed to demonstrate that Turkey can handle pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. Regional analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Assad is preparing for a renewed offensive against opposition-held territories in Idlib, using the border incursion as a distraction or a way to gauge Turkish response times. Another is that Assad is attempting to renegotiate the terms of the Sochi agreement from a position of apparent strength, betting that a limited provocation would give him leverage in future diplomatic talks. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Assad is attempting to drag Turkey into a prolonged confrontation that would strain Turkish resources and fracture NATO unity. But today, Turkey took that card off the table. They didn't delay their response. They didn't seek international consensus before acting. They didn't limit their strikes to symbolic gestures. They launched a comprehensive military operation that neutralized the immediate threat and established clear consequences for future provocations. What we're watching now is a test of deterrence. Assad wants to see whether Turkish resolve will waver under sustained pressure. Turkey wants to show that provocations will be met with overwhelming response. NATO wants to prevent the Syrian conflict from spilling over into a broader regional war, and Russia wants to prevent its Syrian ally from dragging Moscow into a confrontation with a NATO member state. Each of these actors is watching the others carefully. Each is calculating their next move based on what happened today, and each understands that the stakes have never been higher. Tonight, we've heard from Turkish military commanders who are now monitoring Syrian positions along the entire length of the border. They say Syrian forces have begun withdrawing from the buffer zone positions they occupied this morning. They say Assad's air defense systems have gone into what appears to be a defensive posture, a sign that Damascus fears further Turkish strikes. And they say Assad's decision to breach the border was likely part of a broader regional strategy intended to test Western resolve at a moment of perceived distraction. But Turkey is not distracted. In fact, Turkey is more focused than it has been in years. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Assad that provocations will not be tolerated. And it sent a message to NATO that Turkey remains a capable and committed ally on the alliance's most volatile frontier. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Assad hoped to achieve with today's incursion. But what we do know is that Turkey's military response was timely. It prevented Assad from consolidating territorial gains. It demonstrated Turkish capability to respond on short notice, and it reestablished deterrence at a moment when that deterrence was being tested. What happens next will depend on what Assad does in the coming days and weeks. If he accepts today's defeat and returns to the status quo, this moment will be remembered as a failed gambit that exposed Syrian weakness. If he escalates further, Turkey has already shown they are prepared for that possibility. They have shown they are ready to respond, and tonight they proved it. And tonight, for the first time in months, Damascus appears to be reconsidering its assumptions. The Syrian capital is quiet, too quiet. And when Assad is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Assad learned something he should have known all along. Turkey will defend its borders. Turkey will not be deterred by provocations. And Turkey will respond with force when force is required. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Assad tested Turkey's resolve, and Turkey answered. The border remains Turkish, the buffer zone remains intact, and the balance of power remains with Ankara. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.